Hello, welcome to my talk on awakening the ecological self. My name is Magnus Bein, and I will be doing about a 10-minute talk on this concept for you today. First, I want to begin with acknowledgements. I want to acknowledge Lauren Ban at the University of Melbourne for contributing much of the legwork for defining the self, looking at the history, and helping construct this framework. Lawrence Kemmelmeier, who encouraged and sort of seeded that ecocentric, ecological self, is something worthwhile looking at. And Val Schaefer for his encouragement and mentorship in definitions of ecological sustainability. Also want to thank McGill, where I'm doing my graduate research and did my medical studies, as well as my funders at NSERC and the Quebec Centre for Biodiversity Science. So first, let me introduce myself. As I said, I'm Magnus Bein. I'm a recent MD graduate, and I'm aspiring for a psychiatry residency. I'm also a PhD candidate in biology at McGill, where I'm looking at the role of individual variation in the emergent properties of whole systems. And so my objectives for this talk is to generate discussion on the main thesis, which is in development. And basically, it's that self-identity is a key link in realizing ecological sustainability. I'd like to hear feedback on this and also network and link with others that are interested in working on this topic, potentially developing a joint paper or some other initiative. Also just want to note, I have some references mentioned in this presentation, and the bibliography is available for download. So without much further ado, let's get started. In this talk, I'm going to briefly talk about the motivations arising from ecological sustainability, provide an impetus to look at this issue, and also acknowledge the current situation. And then the nuts and bolts of this talk is going to be about the self in the context of sustainability. So I'm going to begin by talking about the role of the individual and self-identity in affecting change. We'll touch a bit briefly, give an overview of a bit of the history and elements of self-concepts in academic and theoretical thought, and then propose a framework that hopefully synthesizes a lot of these ideas and the emerging ideas. And then I'll finish up very briefly with how it maps onto sustainability, and then roll over to discussion, which I've posted in a separate video with preformed questions. So basically our current situation, a situation that's been going on for decades now, is massive change. We're looking at the sixth mass extinction on the history of the planet, and we have things like global warming, which is also changing ecosystems and habitats and affecting both terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems, such as through aquatic oceanic acidification. Concomitant with this, with these massive changes, is industrialization. And we see vast swaths of the Earth's surface and even in water being changed due to industrial activity and actual change of the environment. Urbanization is a major form of this change, which is hosting unprecedented population growth. With all these changes, we're seeing radical shifts in society, culture, and technology is fueling that as well. And this also coincides with changes in the economic system, distribution of wealth, and poverty. And presently, we find ourselves in a pandemic, which, in addition to the health impacts, the serious health impacts, we have a contraction of the global economy, which will likely have spin-off effects. Now, early on, we saw a decrease in CO2 emissions, and so this was intuitive. However, we've seen that it's temporary, that emissions are rising again, and basically there is a push in economic recovery to increase production, and that would mean in our present energy economy, increasing consumption of fossil fuels. The graph to the right touches on that, where we see in 2008 a global financial crisis of a larger scale that decreased the output of the industry and its demand for CO2 based fuels and energy. Whereas in COVID-19, that's on the far right, we see this rebound effect. So our addiction to fossil fuel is proving to be very resilient. Coinciding with this economic disaster is policy response, where there's trillions of fiscal actions being made, putting some nations in debt. And this may have unintended consequences that we're going to also have to deal with. One that even the World Bank and IMF acknowledge is that sustainability policy and targets may be deprioritized, and that was certainly seen in past economic shocks. This data is from the IMF, where they looked at, given an economic disaster, how environmental performance and targets that are tracked in firms changed. And we can see that from pre-shock values, there was over 3 years, maybe even up to 10, before the environmental performance returned to the previous state. So this is suggesting that we also have to look at achieving sustainable targets through bottom-up forces. We knew this before, but now the pressure is so great, given the layers and layers of problems we find ourselves in of a global scale. And so why start with self and identity? Well, this is recognized to be a dynamic and core aspect of experiential change. So when people need to change, they change it through the self-identity. And drawing from this, researchers have found that pro-environmental behavior is linked to an expanded self-definition, and that expanded self-definition incorporates natural systems, the natural world, as well as broader social groupings. And one clarification, too, that researchers have found is that the type of pro-environmental behavior, whether it's more like conforming to new practices that conserve energy or use different types of energy, versus actually changing the community, the governance structures, really depends on identification with politically active groups. We know historically, decades and decades of debate and research, that self-concept varies with culture. And even within cultures, it varies quite a lot. This view was sort of formally acknowledged by Mauss in 1935 and has been developed by many researchers, where we've gone from seeing the sort of dichotomous view between individualism and collectivism to seeing a more pluralistic view where those types of self-constructs can occur within the same society or culture. More recently, we've seen acknowledgement of indigenous peoples' worldviews and their diversity of self-concept. And what's interesting about this view is that it extends it even further, not just having some social influence, but being influenced by the natural world. So that there's relationships that are much like family relationships, for instance, with the natural world, with other species, with places, landscapes. And this reifies or reinforces deep ecology views that are calling for a more ecocentric view where we treat other species as if we would treat friends. So this has been changing the way we view self-concept. And I think it now suggests a more comprehensive framework where we can look at a self-system being composed, whether or not the self in question is aware of it, of being composed and affected and molded by culture and by natural systems. In a sense, an ecocultural concept of the self. Now, its structure is basically that of a bounded self perhaps with a permeable boundary that distinguishes self from non-self, that has a center of gravity. And that center of gravity forms the narratives around which someone's self-identity builds. And so around that center of gravity, that division and boundary between self and non-self can include and relate to other people, objects, animals, and entities, including the natural world. And what's a key aspect of this is that the structure is really about understanding the relationships and the quality of interaction that a self has with the other beings and entities in their self system. So this is the last slide, and this is included in one of my background papers, the Intro to Ecological Sustainability. And what this aims to do is basically match the spectrum of self-concepts ranging from something that's more anthropogenic and isolated and separated, say, from the natural world, or has a narrow sense of what the in-group is, to an ecocentric or biocentric view. And it aims to look at that spectrum from two vantage points when we're looking at and considering what sustainability means. And this is just a preliminary mapping. It's not meant to be exhaustive definitions or definitive definitions of what sustainability is, but just merely to show how a sense of self-identity can really define what we mean by sustainability. So I want to finish off now by thanking you and inviting you to give me feedback and participate in the discussion. Please check out the second video and the slides that go through some potential questions that we could discuss. Thank you.